Today in the workshop, we're putting together a dual boot workstation. You'll see how we can install Windows 11 and Ubuntu Linux 22.04 on one computer. I'll also show you how you can share data between both operating systems. It's a two-sided episode today, so welcome to the workshop. Well, hello and welcome to the workshop, and I've actually got a bit of a problem over here in the workshop. Actually, the problem isn't in the workshop, it's outside in my office where I use my developer's workstation. My developer's workstation is where I pretty well figure out all the code samples and things that I'm going to present to you folks when I create a video and an article, and it's in my office so that I can use it with all of my other computers. Now, the current system is an older machine. It's an Intel i3. It only has 16 gigabytes of RAM, but it's been adequate. It runs Ubuntu Linux and it works fine until about a week or so ago. And a week or so ago, the fan started making this horrible noise, kind of sounding like a cow in labor or something, and I really can't stand being in the office with this fan noise. So naturally, the obvious thing to do would be replace the fan. However, I cannot for the life of me find a replacement fan for this little Asus computer anywhere. So I've decided to build another development workstation, and I'm going to build a dual boot one that can run both Microsoft Windows 11 and Ubuntu Linux 22.04. Now you might wonder, why do I need a dual boot workstation? Why would I need Windows when I've got Linux? Well, I do use Linux primarily, and I'll continue to do that, but there are reasons for having Microsoft Windows. For one thing, I've been working a lot recently with some GPS RTK products, and the software that comes with those only works under Microsoft Windows. Another reason for wanting Windows is that sometimes things operate a little differently under Windows than they do under Linux. And as I'm demonstrating things to you folks, I have to realize that a lot of you would be running Microsoft Windows. So I'm also going to end up converting the computer I have in this room in my workshop into a dual boot system as well. Now, a dual boot system is not exactly a perfect solution, and there's a lot of pluses to it, but there's also a lot of minuses, and there are a few alternatives to it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, we're going to start off by explaining exactly what a dual boot system is and how it works. The hardware requirements for Windows 11 and Ubuntu Linux are fairly similar. On Windows 11, you need to use a processor that is a compatible processor, and Microsoft maintains a list of these processors. There's a link to that list in the article that accompanies this video. The requirement for Ubuntu Linux is simply to use a 64-bit processor. Windows requires a 1 GHz or faster 2 or more core CPU. Interestingly, Ubuntu specifies a 2 GB or faster 2 or more core CPU, but it has been known to run on lesser hardware. You'll need a minimum of 4 GB of RAM to run Microsoft Windows 11 or Ubuntu Linux. However, once again, Linux has been known to run with less memory. Windows 11 will require a minimum of 64 GB of storage on an SSD or hard drive. Ubuntu Linux requires less, about 25 GB of storage, so collectively you'll need about 90 GB of storage to install both operating systems. Ideally, though, you should have much more than that. I'd say a minimum of 128 GB. In order to understand how a dual boot machine works, we need to understand the boot process. The first step is the system startup. This occurs during power up or a reset. In this phase, the BIOS or basic I/O system loads, and a boot monitor loads as well to monitor the boot process. The next phase is the Stage 1 bootloader. In this stage, the master boot record is loaded. This is a small amount of code that lives in a location on the hard disk or SSD. This is not the true bootloader, so the master bootloader will point to the operating system's bootloader. At the Stage 2 bootloader, the operating system bootloader or main bootloader will run, and this will load the required operating system. With Windows 11, the Stage 2 bootloader is the Windows Boot Manager. The Windows Boot Manager loads from the volume boot code. The volume boot code is part of the volume boot record. Windows Boot Manager uses boot configuration data, or BCD data. BCD data is held in a database that is quite similar to the Windows registry. The sequence is that the boot manager loads, it then reads the BCD data, and after that it runs winload.exe, which will load Microsoft Windows. With Ubuntu Linux and many other flavors of Linux as well, the Stage 2 bootloader is known as Grub. Grub is the Grand Unified Bootloader. It takes over operations from the BIOS, and it manages the boot process. It then loads the operating system kernel. In operation, Grub will scan the disk for operating systems. It will record the location of each operating system's bootloader, and then provides a menu system to allow you to choose between the different operating systems, if there are more than one. There are many methods of creating a dual boot Windows and Linux workstation, but we're going to do it as follows. First, we're going to install Windows 11. You could also use a computer that already has Windows 11 on it. The next step is to partition the drive and prepare for the installation of Linux. The third step would then be to install Linux. We need to install Linux last so that we can use Grub as our boot manager. Grub will then provide a menu system that allows us to select between Windows or Linux whenever we boot. We can leave Grub there, or we can replace it with another boot manager. Dual boot machines do have many advantages. They certainly reduce the equipment cost, as you only need one computer instead of two. It expands the number of applications you can run, as you can now run apps for both operating systems. If you're a developer, it also allows you to develop code for different operating systems. Dual boot machines are great for occasional Linux or occasional Windows users who spend most of their time in one OS but occasionally need the features of the other one. There are, however, many disadvantages to dual boot as well. Dual boot obviously reduces the available drive space and swap space, although it is of course possible to create a dual boot machine with separate drives for each operating system. If you're using a common drive between operating systems or a common partition, this can get locked by an incorrect shutdown of one operating system. This will result in the files being read-only to the other operating system, but this can be easily corrected by rebooting in the original OS. There's always the possibility that a Windows update can change the master boot record, rendering the dual boot machine inoperable. This can be repaired fairly easily, however. Power-saving settings used on common peripherals, such as video cards, can affect the other operating system inadvertently if not handled correctly. Despite these disadvantages, I'm going to put together a dual boot Windows, Linux, and Workstation. So let's get our two operating systems working together. So as you see, dual booting has a number of advantages, but it also has some disadvantages, and there are some alternatives to building a dual boot machine, and I wanted to go over them. One of the more obvious alternatives is to run a virtual machine. In this scenario, you would perhaps install Microsoft Windows and then install a virtual machine where you could run Ubuntu Linux. Virtual machines have a number of advantages because you could have more than one virtual machine image, so you could have many different distributions of Linux that you can run under Windows. A lot of virtual machine products also let you copy and paste between the virtual machine and your Windows session. That can be a very handy thing to do. There are problems with virtual machines, however. They usually have to do with the virtual machine not having direct access to the hardware. So sometimes drivers for things like video, etc., don't work properly in virtual machines, but otherwise they can be a very good solution. There's another solution as well called Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, and this is a product from Ubuntu. You run Microsoft Windows and you install this, and you get a terminal version of Ubuntu Linux. So anything you can do with the command line in Ubuntu, you can now do within Windows. And so if you're comfortable working with the Linux command line and don't need a GUI, that can also be a very good option. However, the option I'm going with today is indeed a dual boot workstation, and so let's get on and start working on that. Now we're going to need to download the installation media for the version of Linux that we want to install on our workstation. Now assuming that you're using Ubuntu Linux as I am, that'll put you onto the Ubuntu page where you can download the latest version of Ubuntu Linux. Now as of the filming of this video, that's Ubuntu 22.04 LTS, and the LTS is an abbreviation for long-term support, meaning this is the official version of Ubuntu and it will be supported for several years. If you're watching this video in the future, of course, that may have changed to 24.04 LTS. There will also be interim versions, and you can download one of those as well, but I would recommend using the LTS version. At any rate, you're going to need to go over and click on the download button, and that's going to flip over pages and bring you to a dialog box where you can download an ISO file. Now, I'm not going to go through with it right now because I already have done this, and it's a very large file, so you're going to have to give it a bit of time depending on your internet connection. I believe it's about 5 gigabytes, and of course you're going to have some file space to store it in. But save that file, and I'll show you in a little bit how we can use that to make a bootable USB stick that we can use during our Linux installation. Now, after you finish downloading the installation media for your version of Linux, you're going to want to do the same thing for Windows 11. And I'm on Microsoft's official download page for Windows 11 right now. And this is the only place that you should be downloading Windows 11 from. You don't want to get it from a torrent or from another source. It needs to be from Microsoft. Now, Microsoft, strangely enough, doesn't make this page very easy to find. If you go to their main Windows page and choose to download Windows 11 for a new computer, what you'll go to is a sales page where they try to sell you the license key that you're going to need to activate Windows. Now, of course, the license key is a very important subject, and we'll be talking about it in a few moments, but at the moment, all that we want is the installation media, and so this is the page we go to get it, and we've actually got 3 choices on this page. Now, the first one probably is of no interest to us. It's the Windows 11 Installation Assistant. Now, this is something that you would run on a Windows 10 or Windows 8 machine in order to upgrade it to Windows 11. It's an exe file, and it connects to Microsoft and does everything for you. So that's not really what we want to do. We want the installation media for a new PC. And this is the 2 choices we have over here. Create the Windows 11 installation media or download Windows 11 disk image. Now, if you're running on a Windows machine right now, any version of Windows, Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows 11, you can use this option, and this downloads a small exe file. It opens up a program. It'll prompt you to either insert a blank DVD or a bootable USB, which is what I'll be using, and then it downloads all the installation media and it formats your boot device for you. So it's just the perfect way to go if you're running under Windows. If, however, you're running under Linux, as I am, or Mac OS, you're going to want to go for this option, and that's to download the ISO image, just as we did with Ubuntu. And what you need to do first is select the one. There is only one selected, Windows 11 Multi-Edition. Whether you're running Pro version or a home version is determined by your license key. And then all you need to do is hit this download button. Again, you'll get an ISO file. It's about a 6 gigabyte file, so it takes a while to download, but just save it as you did with the Linux file, and then we'll move on to the next step, which is to create a bootable USB device with those ISO files. Now, in order to create a bootable USB drive from the ISO file that you've downloaded, you're going to need to use a software utility. If you're using Microsoft Windows, an excellent choice would be Rufus. This is a free download, and it will allow you to take your ISO file and format a USB drive correctly. It also has a number of other advanced features that you might find useful for future projects. Another excellent choice is Balena Etcher. Unlike Rufus, Balena Etcher is available for Mac OS, Linux, and for Windows. We've used Balena Etcher quite a few times here in the DroneBot workshop. It's a very easy utility to use, and like Rufus, it'll take your ISO file and create a bootable USB stick. So grab one of these utilities and your ISO files and go and format 2 USB sticks with your operating system. I would strongly recommend using a USB 3 stick if possible, as this will improve the speed and performance of your installation. Now, brief background history on me. At around the turn of the century, I was working in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, as a consultant for a company called TELUS. And most Canadians will know that TELUS is one of our phone and telecommunications companies. Now, TELUS at the time was Microsoft's largest Canadian customer, so large that they had 2 permanent Microsoft employees stationed within our office. And we used to talk to these fellows all the time, and one of the things that we had to talk to them about was Microsoft Windows licensing. Licensing is a very confusing thing with Microsoft Windows, and I don't profess to understand it completely myself. The 2 Microsoft fellows back then didn't understand it completely either, and I think it's still pretty well the same today. But Microsoft Windows does require a license, at least most of the time. There are circumstances where you can use it without a license. So before we install Windows, I want to briefly go over the subject of Microsoft Windows licensing. There are 3 types of license for Microsoft Windows 11: the full package product, the original equipment manufacturer, and the volume license. The full package product, or FPP license, is intended for individuals and for small companies who need less than 5 copies of Windows 11. This license can be purchased from retail merchants or directly from the Microsoft Store. The FPP license is transferable to another computer, so you may remove the license from one machine and transfer it to another one. The original equipment manufacturer, or OEM license, is one that is sold directly to equipment manufacturers. This license key is embedded in the UEFI, which is the Universal Extensible Firmware Interface chip. OEM licenses are not transferable, and they are not intended for resale. The volume license can be used by organizations that have many workstations. This is managed by a Microsoft KMS, or Key Management Services client. With this license, a single key is used for multiple installation of Windows. You don't necessarily have to purchase a new license for Windows 11, as you can reuse license keys from previous versions of Microsoft Windows. If you are doing this, you must match up the Home or Pro versions. In other words, if you have a Windows 10 Home license, you cannot use it to license a Windows 11 Pro version. Utilities like the Magical Jelly Bean Key Finder can display your existing license key. And yes, it's also possible to run Microsoft Windows 11 without a license. The consequence of this is that Windows will display an Activate Windows message in the corner of your desktop. You'll also not be able to perform any personalization options on your machine, such as changing the screen background. In addition, there'll be a number of notifications to activate Windows in the Settings app, but otherwise Windows will function perfectly. So knowing all this, you can determine what the best licensing scenario is for your situation. Now, if you've been watching the DroneBot Workshop for a while, you may recall that about a year and a half ago, I did a Linux workstation build, and for that build, I used an Intel NUC 10, which is a really nice little computer, and I've continued that tradition for this dual boot workstation build. This is also an Intel NUC. This is a NUC 11. It, however, is not quite as powerful as the last computer because that was an Intel i7, whereas this is just an Intel i5. However, it should be quite powerful enough for what I want to do with it. Now, this is again a bare bones kit, so it came without RAM and it came without any form of a drive. I added 64 gigabytes of RAM to the box. I also added 2 drives into it, a 1 terabyte SSD in an M2 form factor, and that's what we're going to be booting off of. And I also have another drive that I took out of my old developer's machine, and it's an SSD that I never used, so it's basically an old but unused drive, and it's a 250 gigabyte drive in a 2.5-inch form factor because this box can accommodate one of each. And so that's in there as a drive that I can share between both Ubuntu and Windows. They'll just have a common file format that they can both understand. You'll also notice that on the top of the box here, of course, I've got my 2 USB keys, one with the Ubuntu installation and one with the Windows 11 installation, and I'll be using Windows 11 first. And I also have my phone over here, which may seem a little bit odd, but that's because I have an existing Microsoft account, and Microsoft has an app called the Authenticator, and my account is set up so that instead of using a password, it's going to send something to my Authenticator account when I log in, so I'll need that when I authenticate during the Windows installation process. But before I get on to installing Windows, I've actually booted up the machine and I'm into my BIOS menu. Now, in order to do that, I press the F2 key. Now, that's not universally true. It's true of a lot of computers that F2 will get you your BIOS menu, but there are other common keys like F9 and F12 that might do it, and you should just check for your model. Also, of course, your BIOS menu will likely look completely different than mine unless you happen to be using an Intel NUC. Now, there is a setting in the BIOS, and that's why I wanted to bring your attention to it, and it's down over here in the boot setting, and specifically the boot priority, and this may also be referred to as the boot order on some BIOSes. It tells you what it's going to boot off of first and second, and right now it's only looking at the Ethernet because it doesn't see any bootable drives on here, because after all I've got 2 drives but neither of them have an operating system on it, and there is no device plugged into the computer. But what I want to do is have it boot off of the USB before it boots off of any hard drive, and so I've got an option over here that says boot USB devices first, and I've got it clicked on, and that's what you're going to need to do in your BIOS. Now, in some BIOSes you may not see this, but you'll be able to select the USB in the drop-down list. I don't think I'm able to do that, but you would be able to do that, and you could set the USB as your first device and then your primary hard drive as your second device. If there was no USB inserted, it would just jump to the second device and boot off the hard drive, but otherwise when you insert a USB, it'll boot off of that. And we need that functionality for both the Windows installation and for the installation of Ubuntu. So once you do that, you'll need to save your settings. I haven't actually made any changes, but the settings over here would be saved. You would just say, yes, I'm going to save my configuration. And then after that, we can boot up with the Windows 11 USB stick in the computer and begin our Windows 11 installation. Okay, so I'm beginning my Windows installation. I've got the USB key with Windows 11 inserted in here, and I've rebooted. My authenticator is standing by on the side over here, and on my screen I've arrived at the Windows setup screen, and it's asking me to pick a language, a time and currency format, and a keyboard format. I'm going to keep them all with the settings I have right now for US English and a US keyboard. I'm going to say install now. And of course, the installation will take a bit of time. I will, of course, fast forward through some parts. Now, this is the point where you activate it, and even if you do have your activation key, I wouldn't recommend putting it in at this point. You can do this later. The reason is we're setting up a dual boot system, and we should really see that everything is working before we activate Windows. So I'll say I don't have a product key. It needs to know what type of Windows I want. I'll choose the type that I want. And then it asks me what kind of an installation I'm going to want to do. No, sorry, first it asked me for the license agreement. I'm getting ahead of myself. Here we go. I'm doing a custom install. It sees that I have 2 different drives over here, and I'm going to do it on drive 1. And we're starting the installation. It's doing some copying, and as I said, I will speed some of this up for you so you don't have to wait through the whole thing. Okay, so I've come to a screen asking me about the country. Now, in my case, no, it's not actually the right country or region, so I'll go up and set that in correctly for myself. But if you're in the US, you could actually just leave it there. I'll say I'm in Canada. I do use a US keyboard, and I'm going to skip a second keyboard layout. Okay, and it's asking for a name of my device. I gave it a name. And it does several reboots during the installation. I'm going to use a personal Microsoft account, and I'll give it the account now. And it sent something to my authenticator, so my authenticator needs to see number 24 in my case, and I'll approve it. And I've been approved. And now it's prompting me to create a PIN number, and this is a very quick way of signing into Windows. It's quite convenient. So I'll set up a PIN, and I'll confirm my PIN number, and I'll say OK. And it's recognizing I have another machine. This was actually a previous iteration of this one. I'm going to set you up as a new device. This will only happen if you have another Windows account you were using before. Do you want to use my location? That's completely up to you. I'll say yes, and then you'll give me the correct weather. No, I don't need to keep track of it. It's going to be only one place. Just require diagnostic data to Microsoft. I don't need to improve that. There's a lot of questions they ask you over here. I think the barrage of questions is over there. To customize my experience, I will skip that. And I'll decline the free trial of Microsoft 365. There's more during the Windows setup, the Game Pass and things like that. There's more in Windows setup now than actually installing the operating system. And this is one way in which I think you'll see the setup differs from Ubuntu. But it does say hi to you. I'll give it credit for that. And finally, we have loaded Windows. And so I've increased the screen resolution on my Windows so you can see it a little bit better. And the very first thing I'm going to do is Windows updates, because there are bound to be several updates for a new installation of Windows. And so you can just go into Settings here, and it is telling me attention is needed to Windows Update. So I can click that, or you can click down the side here to Windows Update. And certainly there are a number of them, and this is going to take a little while, so I'm going to update my Windows before I proceed with anything else. Fast Startup is a feature that's enabled by default in Microsoft Windows, and as its name implies, it allows Windows to start faster. This feature works in conjunction with Windows Hibernate feature. With Fast Startup, sessions are started where they left off as opposed to from scratch, and this greatly decreases the time to load. Unfortunately, Fast Startup can interfere with the dual boot process. It's also possible that Linux can corrupt the Windows boot when Windows is using Fast Startup. For these reasons, we need to disable Fast Startup for our dual boot workstation. Now, in order to disable Fast Startup, we need to load the control panel, and there's probably about a half a dozen ways to do that. One way to do it is to hit All Apps, and go down to the W's and look for Windows Tools, and then hit Control Panel. And in Control Panel, we're going to go into System and Security, and we're going to go down to Power Options. And we have to change what the power buttons do. And you'll notice down here we have shutdown settings, and one of them is turn on Fast Startup, and it's already on, but it's grayed out. We can't do anything with this, but we can change that quite easily. Just go over here to this link that says change settings that are currently unavailable. Click it, and now you can modify your Fast Startup and go down and say Save Changes. And that will stop Fast Startup from running on Microsoft Windows 11. BitLocker is a drive encryption feature for Microsoft Windows. With BitLocker, all of the files on your Windows drive are encrypted. The purpose of BitLocker is to be used on portable machines, so that if your machine is stolen, the files are useless without the BitLocker key. Because of this, BitLocker is not necessary for many users, and unfortunately BitLocker interferes with the Ubuntu installation. You'll need to disable BitLocker in order to do a dual boot installation. Now, when you're finished the dual boot installation, you can re-enable BitLocker if you want it, or you can just leave it alone. Now, in order to disable BitLocker, you need to go to the BitLocker Manager, and the easiest way to find that is just to go to Search and type in BitLocker. You'll see Manage BitLocker, and we can click on that. And over here, we'll see the BitLocker settings, and we can turn it off over here. Now, if you're planning on turning it on again, you should back up your BitLocker recovery key first. So you can click the button over here, and you have a number of choices as to where to back it up to. You can print it out as a number, save it to a file, or just save it to your Microsoft account. And that's what I've done over here. And now I'm going to turn off BitLocker. And after the warning, I'll agree. And BitLocker now needs to do a decrypting operation. And this can take a little bit of time, but as we don't have a lot of data on our hard drive, it won't take that long. So I'm going to let it do that, and we'll move on to the next task. Now we have one more task left to do with Microsoft Windows before we can install Linux, and it's an extremely important task because without it we wouldn't be able to install Linux. We need to make space on the hard drive for our Linux installation. Now on my hard drive, Microsoft Windows would have created a partition for itself, actually a couple of partitions, and it would have taken up pretty well most of the hard drive, and we'd like to reclaim some of that so that we can install Linux. And so we'll need to use the disk manager, and the easiest way to get that is to hold your Windows key down and hold your X key down. So a Windows X, I'll just do that right now. And you get this little menu and go to Disk Management. And here's my disk manager. I'll just make it a little bigger so you can see it. And I have two drives because I added that other drive in. And interestingly enough, my other drive came up as disk number 0. That's this one here. This is the disk that Windows has actually formatted. It's got its boot partition over here at the beginning. And it's also got the general partition for itself and a recovery partition. Now this general partition is quite big. And if we highlight it over here, we can see that this is actually taking up 930 gigabytes of our 1 terabyte drive. So we're going to cut that down. So we can right click on this when we've got it highlighted and do shrink volume. And give it a moment to query the volume. And it's showing us the size before the shrink right now, and the available space that we have that we can shrink, and it suggests the maximum amount of space, which would only leave it with about 61 gigabytes of space, and that's really not enough for Windows. We're going to give it about half the space. So since this is a 1 terabyte drive, I'm going to take this here and divide it in half. Now this is in megabytes, so we're looking for 500,000 megabytes here. And we'll divide that in half, and now it says that we'll end up with about 450 megabytes for Windows and 450 gigabytes for Windows and 500 gigabytes for Linux, and that should be fine. So let's just hit shrink, and it's done. And now you can see we have this unallocated partition over here, and this is the partition that Windows is running in right now. And so now we can just shut down our Windows completely and get ready to install Ubuntu Linux. So now we have Windows installed and we're prepared to install Ubuntu Linux. So let's go and grab our installation media and put Linux onto our workstation. So I've inserted the USB key with the Ubuntu installation files into my computer, and I booted it up, and because I set my BIOS to boot off of USB devices, it went to this menu. And this is actually the grub menu, which is what we're going to be installing to select between our two different operating systems on our workstation. Right now, this is allowing us to select whether to try or install Ubuntu or a couple of other operations. We're going to pick the first one. And we arrive on this screen that gives us two different options, one to try Ubuntu and one to install it. Now normally we would hit install Ubuntu, but because the screen is so small, I'm going to hit try Ubuntu. The reason the screen is so small is because this is a 4K monitor and a 4K recorder, so it set itself up accordingly, but it's pretty hard to read. So I've loaded the Ubuntu desktop, and this is the desktop that you can just use that's running directly off of the USB key, and it's one you can use to evaluate Ubuntu, but I'm just going to use it to reset the video settings here so we can see this a bit better. So I'm going to go into Settings and go to Displays, knock them to 200% and hit Apply. Keep those changes, and now that's a bit easier for my old eyeballs to see. And so now I'll click this icon to install Ubuntu, which basically brings us back to the same installation script we could have selected from the first screen. And the language I'm going to select, of course, is English. And it's an English US keyboard. I want to do a normal installation. And it knows I want to install it alongside the Windows Boot Manager. So it sees Microsoft Windows there, so that's a good sign. And it's telling us what it's going to do to the drive. We hope that it's doing something we want it to do. And it wants to know where we are, so I'll just click that and continue. And now I can give it my computer name. And that's all set up. And the installation is starting. And it's basically just going to keep installing files for a while. And we've finished right now, and it says we can continue testing or we can restart. And so I'm just going to restart the computer, and hopefully we'll now have a dual boot workstation. So I'm booting up the machine after installing Linux, and I've arrived at the grub menu, and as you can't help but notice, it's extraordinarily small. The text is almost impossible to read, and that is because of the setup that I'm using here with a 4K monitor and a 4K video recorder. We'll take care of that in a moment, but first we're going to select the first item, which is to load Ubuntu Linux. We arrive at the Linux login screen, and log in. Okay, we've arrived at our Linux login screen, and as you can see, the resolution is pretty difficult to see. I'm going to do the same thing we did during setup by going into the setup application and boosting that up to 200%. And that's a bit better. Now we can see things. Now the first thing you're going to want to do when installing any operating system, as we did with Windows, is do an update. So let's go in here and search for an update. And here's the software updater. And it looks like we have quite a few updates to install. So let's install our updates and get Ubuntu Linux up to speed. Okay, so we've installed Windows, we've installed Linux, and we've confirmed that the Grub bootloader can load either Linux or Windows. However, we also noticed that the text on that Grub bootloader is extraordinarily small, and that is due to my 4K monitor. Now, I've got a couple of solutions for this. One solution would be just to ignore it, because when I move this machine into my development area in my office, it's got two video monitors hooked to it, and they're both just HD monitors. Neither of them are 4K, so the text should be legible. Another option I have is to edit Grub and to try to change the text size, and you can do that. Another option is to replace Grub with another bootloader, one that perhaps gives me a graphical user interface and a much nicer interface for selecting operating systems. And another option would be to use the Windows bootloader as well. So let's go over some of our bootloader options so you can select the best one for you. If you want to keep using Grub, you can make use of the Grub Customizer. This is a utility that allows you to edit Grub. You can edit the boot order, the text, and also you can add a background image. The Grub Customizer also allows you to edit screen size. However, you should be aware that this doesn't always function correctly. The Grub Customizer is installed in Linux. Berg is a replacement for the Grub bootloader. Berg provides a GUI menu that is much more attractive than the text menu used by Grub. Berg is installed in Linux. Grub to Win still boots with the Grub code. It provides a GUI with many customization features. Unlike the previous two products, Grub to Win installs in Windows. EasyBCD is another option for editing your bootloader. This utility edits the BCD data. Unlike the previous utilities, EasyBCD modifies the Windows Boot Manager menu. EasyBCD is a product that installs in Microsoft Windows. So using one of these options, you can modify the bootloader to suit your own tastes. So now that we've got a dual boot workstation together, what do we do with it? Well, obviously we've got both Linux and Windows, and there are a myriad of different applications we can run, but I want to discuss right now how we can work with both Windows and Linux together. One method we can do this with is to have a shared drive, a drive that is available to both Linux and to Windows. And as you recall, I installed a second SSD into my computer for exactly that purpose. So I want to show you how I set that up, but I also want to show you how you can use development applications such as the Arduino IDE in both environments and share the same data folder so that work that you do in one operating system is also available to you in the other operating system. So let's go ahead and take a look at those things now. Now, in order to create a drive that is accessible to both Windows and Linux, you're going to need to use a file format that is compatible with both operating systems, and you have two choices. One choice would be to use FAT32, but another choice is to use NTFS, which is the native file system used by Microsoft Windows. Now, Ubuntu Linux can read NTFS directly without modification, but some other flavors of Linux may require a driver called NTFS-3G to be installed before it can read that volume. Now, I'm going to be using Disk 0, which is the 500 gigabyte drive that I have installed in my machine that I'm going to be using for sharing. And right now I've removed all volumes from it, so it's completely unallocated. And all you need to do is, when you're in the disk management, is go and right click on it and do New Simple Volume. And you get the New Simple Volume wizard. And it's going to ask you how much space you want to use for it. I'm going to use the maximum amount of space, so I'm just going to accept this. You could always partition this into more than one space if you wish. It says to assign the following drive letter. Remember, in Windows we use letters in order to indicate different volumes, and I'm going to accept drive D, which is shown over here. You could use another letter if you have some reason for doing that. I'll hit next, and it says format it with the following operating system, NTFS, and we can do a quick format. We can put a volume label if you want on it. I'm going to call mine shared. And that's basically it. Now, if you have BitLocker enabled, though, there's one other thing I need to mention. I've turned off BitLocker, and I'm not going to turn it back on. But if you have turned BitLocker back on, you have to make certain that you do not encrypt this drive. Otherwise, you won't be able to use it in Linux. So we're going to say next, and do finish for the wizard to do its work. And that's basically it. I have a drive D over here. Now I have to move over to Linux and mount that drive. And so I've just rebooted into Linux, and if you go down to the side over here, you'll see a couple of drives, and one of them is indeed our shared drive. And here we go. We've got a shared drive. I can create a new folder in here if I wanted to. Just call it test. And it created a new folder for me. So it does appear that I'm able to manipulate the drive, and so Ubuntu is reading NTFS just fine. And I can use this shared drive in order to share data between both Linux and Windows. Now, in order to show you how we can use this shared folder, I've installed the Arduino IDE onto my Windows installation, and it's a fairly simple installation. You just download the file from Arduino and run the exe file in order to get it installed. And I want to set the Arduino IDE so that its Arduino directory, instead of being in my local documents file, is on my shared drive. And I'm going to go into my file manager, although I can do this directly from the IDE if I wish. And here's my shared drive, and you can see we have the one folder we created in Linux, the test folder. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to do a new folder over here, and I'm going to give it a name. And Arduino is a good name for it. I can just minimize that right now. Now on my IDE, I can go up into Preferences, and where the sketchbook location is, I can hit the Browse button, go down to here to Shared. I can select Arduino, say Open, and say OK. And so now I should be saving stuff onto that drive. So let's just open up one of the example sketches right now. Let's open everyone's favorite SketchUp. I'm going to do a save as for Blink. And I'm going to call it Blink 2. Go back into my file manager, go into Arduino. You can see now Blink 2 has been saved in my common Arduino folder. And so this folder is also, of course, available to my Linux side. So let's go into Linux right now and see if we can find that. And so now I've rebooted in Linux, and I've also installed the Arduino IDE in Linux. And if you need instructions for doing that, by the way, the previous video and article I did regarding building a Linux workstation will show you how to set the IDE up in Linux and also how to set the permissions for your USB ports correctly. Now I'm going to go into File and Preferences over here, and I've already set this up, but I want to show you what I did here. I have set this up to the same location on the shared drive here, which is media/DroneBot Workshop/shared/Arduino. Now you will find the browse button over here when you come from the default doesn't actually show you the shared folder. So the way that you can get that is to open up your shared folder and to go and do a properties, and you will see the parent folder over here. And this is the properties of the Arduino folder that I created earlier when I was in Windows. And so you're going to copy that parent folder in, but then you're going to append the name of the folder, which is Arduino. So the final path comes out over here as media/DroneBot Workshop/shared/Arduino. Now, we'll test that out right now by installing a library. So let's go into our library manager. And a good library to install would be the DHT22. And here's the Adafruit library for that, which we're going to want anyway. So I'm going to do an installation of that. And I'm going to install all the code for it because it's part of the Adafruit Unified Sensor library. And so now that's been installed and been closed. And so what we can do is go back into our shared folder here. And we can see libraries. And there's our DHT22 library. And so this is also now available to our code in Windows. So any libraries that we install here will be available in both Windows and Linux. And so we can work between both environments with the Arduino IDE and keep our code constant. And so just to finish things off, as you can see, I'm back in Windows and my desktop has changed because I have now added the license key onto Windows to license it. And in actual fact, what I used for my license key was a Windows 7 Pro license key that I still had, and it worked just fine. So now my Windows allows me to do personalization. And I changed my desktop background and added a few more utilities and applications. One amusing thing was adding Google Chrome. When I started installing Chrome, Microsoft complained, no, you have to use Edge. Please don't use Chrome. Please don't use it. And they really fight you on that sort of thing. I think that they still don't realize that most of us were stung by Internet Explorer and aren't really interested in Microsoft browsers. But in addition to Chrome and Opera and Firefox, I installed a couple of other programs. One thing I wanted to show you is this one over here. And this one is called Iomi Backer Upper. And this is, as it would imply, a backup utility. And it's a good thing to have a backup utility for your workstation. This one was free, and it does a partition backup, which is excellent. And so I've added a 5 terabyte hard drive, an external drive to this machine, just so I could do backups. And again, it's a good idea to do backups. There also are utilities that you can mount onto a USB stick to do recovery with, and that's also a very good idea. And if you want some more details about those types of utilities, you can just go and check out the article in the DroneBotWorkshop.com website that accompanies this video, and I've got a list of a few of them and some links to them that you can go and download. So now my Windows is all set and ready to go. And last but not least, I've booted Windows again, and as you can see, I've customized this as well and added a number of different applications. And if you want to know how to install some of these apps, once again, you can just take a look at my previous video on doing a Linux workstation, and there'll be a link to that video in the description, as well as in the article in the DroneBotWorkshop.com website. So now it appears that I have a brand new developer's workstation. It dual boots both Windows and Linux, and it's certainly a lot quieter than the one I used to have, and hopefully it'll give me many years of service, and I hope this has helped you in order to build a workstation of your own. Okay, so that about wraps it up. We now have a dual boot developer's workstation that we can work on using either Microsoft Windows 11 or Ubuntu Linux 22.04. And the principles I gave you would apply to booting Windows with other versions of Linux as well, so you're not exactly glued to Ubuntu. Now, if you need some more information about the stuff we talked about today, you can head over to the dronebotworkshop.com website, where you will find an article that accompanies this video. And if you need some of the links to some of the stuff that I used, you'll find those links inside the article. While you're on the website, if you haven't yet, please subscribe to my newsletter. It's not a sales letter, it's just something I send out occasionally to let you know what's going on here in the workshop and bring you up to date on some interesting facts about this wonderful world of electronics that we're using. If you want to discuss this wonderful world of electronics, or if you want to show off your dual boot workstation, head over to the DroneBot Workshop forums. You'll find a bunch of like-minded people over there who are happy to help you with your projects and would probably love to hear what it is that you're working on. And finally, if you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel yet, please do. I love getting new subscribers, and subscribing is a very easy thing to do. All you need to do is hit the little subscribe button below the video and then click on that bell notification so that you'll get notified every time that I make a new video. So until we meet the next time, please stay safe out there. Please take very good care of yourself, and I'll see you again very soon in the DroneBot Workshop. Goodbye for now.